Good morning, students, and welcome back to Political Sociology. And this week we are going to investigate some of the work that's been done by various theorists and analysts. And the message is, a little change of pace, you are not powerless. You are not ultimately the victim of domination in all instances, in all cases. The oligarchy, the capitalist class, and the forces of darkness cannot always win and cannot always control you. And this brings us to the work of Frances FoxPiven, who wrote a very important piece when she was president of the American Sociological Association on interdependent power, something that has been a part of her research, analysis, theorizing, and general sociological work for many, many years. So, you are fortunate to be able to be exposed to this. You can thank me later. It's okay. No one ever gets in touch with me anyway. No one shows up for office hours. Nobody comes to talk about the election. Not sure what it is with these classes, but they become quite impersonal. Nonetheless, this is important stuff. I hope you pay attention, and I hope you're still tuning in. If you're not, then you're obviously not learning anything. And that, by the way, that is the purpose of this enterprise. I know sometimes we forget that, and you think, well, the purpose of this enterprise is simply to collect credits and get a degree, or manage your education as efficiently as possible, which sometimes means, I hate to say this, but the least amount of work producing the best results. So, okay, I'm in a little cynical mood this morning. In any case, let's talk a little bit about Frances FoxPiven to begin with, because she is a major, major figure in sociology. And she's been at it for a long time. And I thought you'd be interested in knowing, probably the work that she is best known for is Poor People's Movements. She wrote with, I think it might have been her husband, Richard Cloward. He's a political scientist. They wrote numerous articles, several books together. This might have been the most noteworthy early in her career, and it made a significant impact on how we study political movements, social movements, and what kinds of tactics ultimately are successful, why they succeed and how they fail, as the subtitle of the book indicates. And one of the more provocative discoveries that Piven and Cloward made during their analyses and observations and study of social movements in the United States was that disruptive social movements that sort of undermine the social order in either locations or more broadly tend to get the most positive results ultimately. So some people view this as kind of an insurrectionist approach to thinking about social movements, that there has to be a kind of insurrection that disrupts, creates civil disorder, direct action that ultimately brings so much chaos to the normal operation of society that the officials, the elite, have to respond in some way to bring the society back to some form of predictable order. And in fact, that is the case. That's why many of us who, when we talk about real social change, we say real social change only takes place when you have a very active social movement that is able to disrupt, engage in civil disobedience, and ultimately threaten the operation of whatever the system depends on. Capitalism, the movement of goods, whatever it happens to be. So we have learned a lot from their work, Piven and Cloward. Piven got a lot of media attention probably about 10 years ago when Glenn Beck, I don't know how many of you know Glenn Beck. Glenn Beck was a commentator on Fox News. He decided to have a continuous series of programs highlighting the threat to American society posed by Piven and Cloward. You could probably look up some of this stuff on YouTube and see some of his broadcasts. And it, of course, the people who watch Fox News and who were Glenn Beck fans were listening to this, and he was saying, she basically is arguing for a revolution in the United States to overthrow the way of life that we all love as Americans. And she started getting death threats, and so there was an article in The Guardian, that's what the photo on the left is taken from, of Frances Fox Piven. She's quite toward the end of her career at this point. She found the whole thing ridiculous, but then she realized that some people were actually believing some of the outrageous claims that Glenn Beck was making. On the other hand, she has studied and social movements that have been informed by her work definitely would take a more radical approach to protest. So that's a little background on Frances Fox Piven. I encourage you to look at her work. Wonderful scholar, sociologist. I hold her in the highest regard. I believe Richard Cloward passed away some time ago. All right, so what's Piven's basic fundamental argument? And the point is one that sociologists are quite aware of. When we think about any kind of institution sociologically, we think about interdependence. It's a fundamental sociological concept that is closely connected to the work of the classical social theorist Emile Durkheim. But for Piven, we need to think about how this institutional fact of interdependence translates into potentials for power. So as she says, the institutions can be quite hierarchical. They can be unequal. They can be oppressive. You can have managers. You can have capitalists who obviously possess enormous amounts of power vis-a-vis the workers in any organization, for example. But every organization, every institution relies on compliance and cooperation. No organization or institution can accomplish its goals, can be effective, if human beings do not in some way submit, comply, and cooperate. And so, if that is what organizations or institutions depend on, then the withdrawal of compliance and cooperation will bring those institutions to a standstill and is a source of what she calls, there are different terms for this. The term she uses is interdependent power. Notice that when we start thinking about this form of power, we're thinking about it in a more institutional, organizational context than the entire broad political system, though it certainly can apply to that as well, as I'll mention in a moment. So withdrawing or threatening to withdraw cooperation, your labor power, okay, this is a very Marxian concept. So here we have a nice integration of Durkheimian and Marxian theoretical threads and insights. Labor withdrawing their labor power, not participating, this will render institutions unable to achieve their objectives, their outcomes, their mission, their purpose. Very important way to think about power. You're all students. The institution of the university depends on all of you to actually show up, attend classes, and essentially cooperate and comply. If for some reason you thought the institution was operating in a way that you found undesirable, and it's obviously a highly undemocratic institution at almost every level, you could easily shut it down. You can't do this individually. One student isn't going to, says, I'm not going to show up for classes. You will be penalized. This is the problem with individual versus collective action. But if every student, or at least a large majority of students at the University of North Florida, decided that they would not attend the university at all, the institution would obviously come to a grinding halt, as would be the case if all the faculty did that, or all the administrators, right? Okay, so I'm not suggesting you necessarily do that, although I have to say I'm always surprised at how weak the student level of organization is, considering this amount of, let's call it, latent power. Now, we'll come back to that, that you possess. Okay, so these are just some points that are made along the way, or things that I think about when I read about interdependent power. We think of it as a basis for disruptive action. That's another way to think about the exercise of interdependent power. You're disrupting an organization's operations. Power not based exclusively on material resources. Again, this is an important point because throughout this semester we have talked about the fact that the power of the elite, the capitalist class, the plutocracy, the oligarchy, whatever you want to call them, is based largely on the ownership of property, the ownership of material resources. Well, that is not the case in the example, the process of exercising interdependent power. It's based on your position in institutions and organizations, and the extent to which those who have material power rely on your positional power. These are all terms that tend to be used to describe the kind of thing that Piven is talking about. All institutions depend on cooperation and compliance, as we said. Capitalists depend on workers to produce surplus value. One of the points I made early on during the COVID-19 pandemic was that, why are people trying to push all workers back into the workplace when it could be dangerous, it could be unsafe, they may not be protected, they may not have sufficient PPEs. Well, capitalists can't make a profit if they're not exploiting workers. So you had a very interesting phenomena taking place. It was like a natural experiment in terms of the nature of the relationship between the owners and workers. We'll talk a little more about that in a moment. And it can take unruly forms. That's a quote. There should be an end quote there as well. And I have a piece that is posted in Canvas that talks about Piven advocating unruly forms. Direct action. Often when people propose a direct action, what they're saying is that, yeah, we're going to protest. We're just not going to march down the street and chant, solidarity slogans. We're actually going to engage in some kind of action that is disruptive. That's what direct action means. You're shutting something down. You're disrupting something. You're intervening in the normal operations. In my review of the election that hopefully you looked at, it's my post-election analysis commentary. At the very end of that, I mentioned that there are organizations currently that are preparing for the possibility that Donald Trump would not leave office or use some legal or extra-legal mechanism to steal the election, so to speak. What are people going to do about that? And one of the proposals was direct action, shut down the country, engage in a general strike. So the strike is one of the most obvious forms of the exercise of interdependent power that labor has, that workers have, that those who have relatively less power can exercise. The general strike, rarely exercised, but sort of the utopian dream of the left is that all workers will walk off the job across the entire country, or you could have a general strike in a city. I believe there was a general strike at one time in Oakland, a very powerful general strike where you were able to, it's not easy to do this, to get all the workers to agree to walk off the job on a day or during a week and just literally shut down the system. And this is often a way to gain concessions. So people have mentioned a general strike as a way to address, for example, an action like a coup where the president would, essentially illegally seize power. All right, the walkout. We know that workers walk out. That's another exercise. This has happened in the fast food industry as people are fighting for $15 an hour because of minimum wage workers. The slowdown. This is a classic case where workers begin to work a little slower, not really exercising all the effort and energy that they normally would, or that managers assume workers are capable of. And there's lots of subtle ways that workers in organizations, and again, notice that when I'm talking about this interdependent power, I'm talking very much about the ability to exercise this within the workplace, within an organizational or institutional setting. And of course, sabotage. You can sabotage an institution, organization in a variety of ways. So people who study worker actions, worker resistance, I'm going to teach the sociology of work on occasion, they will use various techniques within the workplace to undermine the power of managers and to exercise some level of resistance in any way that they can. Latent and manifest power. So one of the points that those who study interdependent power make is that all individuals who work in an institution or organization exercise latent power by virtue of the fact that the organization or institution could not operate without their compliance and cooperation. And in most cases, people comply and they cooperate and there is no issue, right? So that's the power is latent. In other words, it's always there, but not necessarily exercised. Manifest power is when you're actually exercising that power. And rules and rule breaking, which occurs routinely in any kind of organization or institution where you have bureaucratic rules. This is another way to exercise power in small ways, but ways which often give people the sense of having some level of agency and dignity in their lives, in their work lives. Collective action, obviously, as I said, is the best way to achieve this. Rather than individuals striking out, it's much more effective if all workers agree to engage in whatever action is proposed as an exercise of manifest interdependent power. And this works against the kind of ideology that is embedded in our brains, and that is that, the people who are really indispensable, the people that really make things happen, the ones who ultimately are responsible for the efficient and productive operation of an institution or organization are the managers, right? Because they do the mental work often in organizations where other people do the manual work. And so this ideology of superordinate, that simply means those above, indispensability is a very powerful ideology that has to be overcome for people to realize their own indispensability. Okay, I just want to touch briefly on a debate within sociology, sociological theory. If you take a social theory course, you may be introduced to the idea of what's called the structure agency debate. And if you've taken sociology classes, and this class is probably no significant departure from this emphasis, we tend to focus the way in which structure shapes, controls, and ultimately determines what humans do. Now, this poses a little bit of a problem because some people will say, well, don't workers have any agency? Don't they have any ability to exercise some autonomy and therefore impact the larger organization or the institution? Or are people just ultimately controlled and determined by the structures of power? Now, clearly, interdependent power brings agency back into the picture. You understand? And that's important. There's a quote by Marx that sort of gets at this structure agency question. I'm going to paraphrase, but basically he said, let's see, workers make their own history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. So worker actions shape the society, shape history. That's the agency side, but they don't make and take those actions under conditions that they created. They're responding to conditions that are imposed upon them. So in other words, the kind of action that workers would take is highly dependent on the particular structure in which they find themselves. So this is some way, and there's an enormous literature here I'm not going to go into because it gets into a kind of esoteric theoretical debate, but it is important because sometimes I think sociologists tend to focus too much on structural determination rather than what I'll call agential agency, human autonomy, power. Piven, obviously, is making a kind of contribution to this, but she's sort of sidestepping in her article all of the heavy theoretical arguments that have been made. Much of this gets into philosophical questions as well about free will. But let me say something about this question very briefly. Because, how can you reconcile structure and agency? This has been sort of the challenge for social theory, to understand what's happening in the world, not taking a fully, and what is typically maybe the tendency in sociology to take a structurally determinist view. Anthony Giddens is probably one of the most prominent sociological theorists in the world. And he has struggled with this question, and he developed this term structuration. Now, what's interesting about that term is it essentially implies that structures are in the process of being produced, structuration. How are structures shaped and produced? And in his elaboration of this question, he came up with what he called the dialectic of control. And I think this is very closely connected to Piven's interdependent power. I'm not sure she makes sufficient acknowledgement of Giddens' contribution here. The dialectic of control, and I'll simply read this, no matter how great the scope or intensity of control superordinates possess, those with power, managers, owners, since their power presumes the active compliance of others, capitalists can't make profit without the compliance of workers or the exploitation of workers. Those others, let's say workers, can bring to bear strategies of their own and apply specific sanctions. And so it's out of this interchange that structures emerge and that structures change. Structuration, a process of creating and producing structures. All right. So, what is this figure? Many years ago, I used to teach organization theory. I wrote a organization theory book that was used in courses, and I was trying to lay out a way to understand the evolution of organizational theories and management strategies. Historically, how they've evolved. And And to some extent, the argument I made is very consistent with what both Piven and Giddens are talking about. So just to highlight this, let's see if I can use the pen since I'm sitting here. All right. Let's see. I'm going to use a pen. All right. Let's see if I can do this. All right. So, managers devise some kind of organizational technique. Usually these are designed to structure the workplace in such a fashion that they will get workers to do what they want them to do. These are systems of control. We can call them systems of social control. These are imposed on what I call the human factor of production. And remember, all of this interdependent power depends on human subjective understandings, consciousness, reactions to things that are happening to them. So you impose some organizational system on the human factor of production. Humans react to this. They respond to it. And they respond in ways that are not necessarily anticipated by managers. We sometimes call this the unintended consequences. And therefore, managers have to somehow adopt and change and revise what they're doing because of the way that humans respond. And that has, if you follow organization theory, has actually resulted in changing the way managers and organizational theorists, managerial consultants, think about the next strategy that should be used because one strategy wasn't as successful and effective as another. So that's just one example in the context of organizations that I tried to outline in my book. And what I was trying to argue in my book throughout the entire, every chapter, was that we can understand what happens in organizations very much by this interface between structure, managerial structures imposed on workers, and the human factor response to those. And I outlined this in a broader way for students to think about a paradox model generally. If you take classes, you know that I like to emphasize the role of paradox. And so I try to lay out here what I call a paradox model. And you have the action here. And the action that someone is engaging in could be a effort to accomplish some particular goal, has an intended consequence. I'm going to put this in place in order to achieve this particular goal. That's the intended consequence. Of course, in sociology, we also emphasize the unintended consequence. So if you have the intended consequence, if you follow it down at the bottom, that then in turn has a positive effect on the ultimate organizational objective you were trying to achieve. But if there's an unintended consequence, often the unintended consequence can undermine your organizational objective. Let me give a classic example of this. At one time, workers were there was something called a putting out system where capitalists would give workers the materials, the tools, and then workers would produce some product, some commodity in their home. And then they would turn them over to the capitalist, and the capitalist would sell them. The capitalists thought this isn't a very good system because, I don't know how hard that person is working at home. Maybe they could be working harder. Maybe we could intensify the level of productivity. So the action was, let's bring the workers together into a factory. Now, what I'm describing is a long, drawn-out system historically, but the action was, let's bring all the workers together in a factory where we can supervise and monitor and ensure that they're working as hard as they should. So the intended consequence would be that workers would, because they're working in a factory, they're being monitored and supervised, they will work harder, and the organizational objective is more will be produced, more productivity, more profit. What's an unintended consequence? Maybe we could say an unanticipated consequence. Well, when they brought all these workers together, the workers started communicating with each other. Before, they couldn't communicate with each other because they were all isolated, separated, fragmented, geographically, spatially. Now they're all together under one roof. And they turn to each other and they start talking to each other about the nature of work and how hard it is and how they feel like they're being exploited and abused and disrespected. And then they organize the unintended consequence. And then there's an organization of workers demanding this, demanding that, walking out collectively. Obviously, that has a negative effect on organizational objective. So that's the paradox model I was trying to use for people to understand. One of the most significant dynamics, I would say the most significant managerial challenge in any organization is the reaction of the human factor to what managers impose on them. That's the purpose of this diagram. Essential workers. Essential workers. Think about this. This is a new term, isn't it? It's very interesting. I'm highlighting this because there's been so much written, so much said, so much media attention devoted to essential workers. Who are the essential workers? The indispensable workers. Essential workers, workers that were doing routine jobs that were low paying and insecure and precarious. And now we call them essential. This is testimony to what Piven is talking about. And now, if they're essential, they're interdependent. I'm sorry, they're indispensable, right? They can exercise interdependent power. Suddenly, these workers may realize they have always had latent power, but now they can translate that latent power into manifest power. Very interesting. So this is how a crisis, in this case the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic and its impact on our economy, and how did we keep the economy going? How did people stay alive? Who did they depend on the most for survival? For some minimal level of functioning to keep things going sufficiently so that people could get by. We depended on essential workers. And we have some nice headlines here. I always like to show the significance of these things with the headlines. The one on top, workers are more valuable than CEOs. I always knew that, but the average American doesn't believe that because they've been brainwashed to think CEOs are indispensable and workers are easily replaced. And as far as CEOs go, they want workers to be easily replaced. The subheading here, heading of this article, the coronavirus pandemic has revealed a simple fact. It's low-wage workers, cleaners, cashiers, care workers, that make the society run. If they withhold their labor power, if they walk off, the society can't run. It's not the bankers. It's not the hedge fund managers. It's not the landlords. It's not the CEOs. What is the lesson we will learn from this? Politically, my fear is once the coronavirus passes, we will be told that everything can go back to normal. The collective power of the pandemic's essential work. Collective power. Notice that word is used. Both of those articles. It's the key. Good stuff. Sociologically, we need to use that sociological lens to understand the way in which these events that take place have enormous socioeconomic and political consequences and opportunities. Is this the same one? Oh, I know what I wanted to show you. The top item is an article by Piven where she's applying her interdependent power theory to strategy for the Occupy movement. So again, we sometimes talk about applied sociology. We don't usually think of applied sociology in this way, but the point is, how do we take the lessons we have from sociological analysis and apply them, as Piven and Cloward have always done, apply them to the real world of politics in order to organize for progressive social change. I love this stuff. It's a wonderful book written by the political economist Beverly Silver. Check out her work. She's written books on globalization and the history of workers' movements. And one of the most significant is this book, Forces of Labor. She makes a distinction which she can attribute to the work of Eric Olin Wright, who I've spoken about earlier in the semester, and you read one of his articles. And it's a difference between associational power and structural power. And this is importantly related to this idea of interdependent power. Now, associational power is the power that workers gain from joining together in a labor union. That would be the best example of associational power. Structural power is the power workers have by virtue of their location, their structural location in the production system of capitalism that gives them some enormous or significant leverage. So one of the things that Silver does in her book is she talks about how associational and structural power have been used and can be used. And I want to give you an example of this. And this is something she discusses in her book. So, globalization, and I haven't talked a lot about this. I do in social change and international development. But one way to think about globalization is that it involves corporate restructuring, which occurred during the crisis of the 1970s as we moved into the neoliberal era. And we've talked about some of the characteristics of neoliberalism. One of them was corporate restructuring and the rollback of any kind of regulations that would limit the movement of capital, the restructuring of productive operations. And so you had a continuous process of, through the 80s and 90s into the 2000s, outsourcing certain activities of the corporation to contractors and offshoring that activity to locations where wages are low, regulations are few, and taxes and other kinds of costs are minimal. So you can think of this as a kind of extended division of labor. At one time, the corporation was encouraged to be vertically integrated. You need to control every aspect of the operation. You can't leave things to chance. You make yourself vulnerable. But under neoliberalism, there was a movement toward what we call vertical disintegration, where you essentially take the corporation and outsource those things which aren't core competencies, the things that you do that are most central and important and valuable. And you can outsource the other stuff to subcontractors who can compete for your business. So you had this movement toward vertical disintegration. Also, we have what's called just-in-time systems. I'll talk a little more about this in a future lecture. But the idea is that you don't want to be producing large quantities of something and storing it in a warehouse and hoping that people will purchase it, or then you have to market it to get them to purchase it. What you want to do is keep track of exactly what people want, what they're buying at the moment, and be producing and having delivered to your distribution center stuff that can be sold immediately. You can't make a profit if you have lots of goods that are sitting around waiting to be sold. You want to sell the stuff immediately to realize the profit that's embedded in those commodities. So we moved from a just in case, well, we better stockpile those because we never know if there might be a crop, to a just in time. Deliver it just in time so I can sell it immediately and make immediate profit. And I'm going to talk about choke points. So think about the global system now, okay? The way we've restructured production globally. Here's a little stylistic way to think about, let me move this up, to think about vertical integration versus vertically disintegrated. So a vertically integrated firm is one, research and development, supplies, components, parts, inputs are produced by a factory that is part of your corporation. Branding and marketing is run by your corporation. Manufacturing, the actual production, you control all of this, right? So the idea was the vertically integrated firm has total control of every aspect of the operation. We then had this movement, vertical disintegration, outsource, right? So some of these activities might be better handled, outsourced, subcontracted by other firms. You can tell them what you want and how you want it done, but they can do it. And maybe they can do it cheaper, particularly if they're located in another country. So you had a movement from the vertically integrated to the vertically disintegrated. All right. This is the kind of image I sometimes create with PowerPoint that just confuses people. But here's what I want you to think about. Think about a company like Apple or Nike. Apple produces nothing. Nike produces nothing. Apple and Nike have research and development. They design their product. They market it. They obviously brand it. It's the brand. It's the icon. It's the image they put on it that actually brings the value to it in the way that the current global system of value capture is organized. So what do? They're going to outsource like the parts and the inputs. Whatever goes into the final product, be it a sneaker or some electronic good, we're going to let some other company produce those. Okay, so I have the parts and inputs. Maybe that's a company you see that exists in the United States. That's okay. But the manufacturing, the assembly, the work is done in China because you can pay workers in Chinese factories with subcontractors that run those factories for virtually nothing. So all of those materials are sent over to China. The assembly, the manufacturing of the electronic good or the sneakers is done there. And then it's exported from China and imported back to the United States. Now you see that this may be a very profitable arrangement for these companies. They don't have to any longer invest and have money and capital tied up in factories, and ideally not a lot in warehouses, because they want the stuff delivered and produced just in time to get on the shelf and be sold to realize profit. This is the global, so we call these global value chains. This is a very typical arrangement, the Nikeification of the corporation. Now notice there's a greater division of labor. There's greater interdependence. The company, the corporation, doesn't have full control. They're heavily dependent on certain things happening in order for this to work. You understand? So the point is they are more vulnerable. That's the unintended consequence. On the one hand, they did this to maximize profit. On the other hand, they have created a certain level of vulnerability. And what Beverly Silver talks about is the way in which workers can exploit the vulnerability of the production system globally to their advantage. Now, when I talk about this in my classes, I emphasize the importance of transportation logistics. The reason transportation logistics has become so important in business schools and has become a huge industry of its own. By the way, an industry and an area of study and an academic department that didn't exist 25, 30 years ago. Why is it so important now? Because goods are being produced in China, for example, and they have to be brought back to the United States to be consumed. The separation of production, China, consumption in the United States, elevates the importance of moving the crap, the goods, from the point of production to the point of consumption. This has to be done. Moving imported goods as quickly and as cheaply as possible from the point of production to the point of consumption is, from my perspective, the primary objective of logistics, or what they like to call over in the business school, supply side management. This creates vulnerabilities. And here's the point. This creates enormous amount of interdependent power for people in transportation and logistics. Let me just give you one little example. The image at the bottom here is a poster that is up in my office because I spent probably 7 or 8 years devoting my energy to studying the global movement of commodities through ports. And we have a port here in Jacksonville. You can see that in the image. Now the heading of this poster that I have in my office, choke points. Now, if you go over to the business school, they would give this a different title. They would say, these are the portals by which commerce meets the needs of American consumers. Consumers, right? Okay, yes, great, wonderful. But, we sociologists, we think about it differently. These are choke points. These are points that can be choked off if you want to exercise power. And notice the headline from a business publication. How 14,000 workers managed to slow down the entire economy. Who are those workers? Longshore workers. They're the ones that take the containers off of the container vessels and move them off of the terminal, the container terminal, to rail or to a truck to then be moved to a distribution center. Never use the word warehouse. Distribution center, which then will disperse those goods to the retail outlets that all of you love to spend time walking through, touching all of the objects at Walmart. Don't shop at Walmart, by the way. That's just don't shop at Walmart. Enormous amounts of power. We talk about the essential workers. Getting the goods. Getting the goods. How do the goods get to their destination? And how much power does transportation and logistic workers have? They can shut down the entire economy because now almost every good that we consume, tangible goods, durable goods, is imported, is brought through these ports. Those circles at the bottom identify, the size of those circles identify the significance of the ports. You will notice that LA Long Beach is the largest port in the United States, one of the largest ports in the world. Lots of stuff coming from Asia crosses the Pacific Ocean and enters there. But there are also ports, as you can see, on the East Coast. And you have the International Longshore Workers, Longshoremen Association on the East Coast, and the International Longshore and Warehouse Union on the West Coast. These are probably the most powerful unions in the United States, and the workers in those unions receive very, very high levels of compensation. Now, capitalist class, has done everything they can to circumvent the power of those workers by automating, by creating cranes, by using containers, which has minimized the workforce significantly. All kinds of automation has been applied to container terminals. So the number of workers who are employed by the longshore workers unions has dwindled, but the point is they can shut the joint down. And I can tell you that the union that represents longshore workers on the West Coast is much more militant, much more progressive, and much more willing to take action than on the East Coast. And they have done that in solidarity with various movements that have taken place in the United States. All right, interdependent power. Very, very important stuff. That concludes this lecture. I will see you later, or not.